The energy inefficiency of our homes is one of the biggest barriers to meeting our climate targets. Heating and electricity make up a huge portion of our greenhouse gas emissions, and those emissions are rising. At the same time, millions of people live in housing that's drafty, expensive to heat, unhealthy, or even unsafe. Could retrofitting homes at scale be a climate solution that also improves health, lowers energy costs, and promotes housing justice?
Hello, and welcome to Pullback, where we ask experts to explain big ideas so you get the full story behind the hype. Pullback is a proud member of the Harbinger Media Network of progressive Canadian podcasts. I'm Kristen Pugh, and I'm here with my co-host, Kyla Hewson.
On today's episode, we spoke with Abhi Kantamneni. Abhi is the Director of Action Research with Efficiency Canada, an organization that studies the technology, governance, and business systems influencing Canada's energy future. Abhi has a decade of experience helping communities across the United States and Canada use clean and efficient energy to achieve local priorities, including improving housing, increasing good jobs, and reducing poverty.
In this conversation, Abhi highlighted how much energy is wasted in our homes, and it's often without us realizing. From drafty windows to aging heating systems, many people only make upgrades when something breaks, often in moments of crisis. Abhi makes the case for a coordinated government-led retrofit strategy that supports renters and homeowners alike, not just to reduce emissions, but to lower energy bills, improve health, and address poverty through climate action. All right, let's get started. Can you tell us what energy poverty is and why it matters?
Great question. So, believe it or not, energy poverty is really, really difficult to define. In some instances, it's fairly obvious, right? So, I'll give you an example. I grew up in India and we had 8 hours of what they called rolling blackouts. So, you didn't have power for 8 hours in a day. And so it's fairly obvious what energy poverty means in that context. So originally, the concept was developed to define lack of access to adequate energy to just meet your daily needs. Now, here in Canada, it's not so obvious. And a lot of what manifests as energy poverty in Canada, urban Canada especially, and rural Canada, happens behind closed doors. And now there's different ways that different governments and folks have tried to define it. Canada is one of the few, I'd say, G7, G8 countries that does not have an official definition of energy poverty. So I think it's commonly understood to be that lack of access to adequate and affordable energy services in your home hurts your well-being. Now, the way I like to think of energy poverty and the way I think it makes most sense to me, if you think of this on a scale, right? So on one end, you have well-being. So energy used in your home can contribute to well-being, keeping your home warm and comfortable through all seasons or cold in the summers and things like that. Energy poverty is the opposite of what you can think of as well-being. And another way to think of energy poverty is due to lack of access to adequate and affordable energy in your home, your pre-existing vulnerabilities or risks, depending on who you are, energy poverty makes everything worse.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what might cause barriers to access to adequate and affordable energy.
We have a story in, Indian folklore or in Indian mythology, and it goes roughly like this. You take 6 blindfolded people. They don't know what they are seeing or hearing or touching or feeling, and you put them in front of an elephant. We have a lot of elephants roaming around in India. When I grew up, there was a temple you could go to and get blessed by a little elephant. You could give it a banana and it'll give you a little boop on your head with its trunk. If 6 blindfolded people were to interact with an elephant, so one person touches the tusks and they say, oh my God, I think I'm holding onto a spear, right? And another person holds onto the leg and thinks it's the trunk of a tree, and you get the general idea. And energy poverty is actually in Canada is actually like that, is that it shows up in different ways in different people's lives based on their own vulnerabilities or based on their own lived experience. So the determinants, so the root causes of energy poverty might be common, right? So it's an interplay between one of 3 things: low disposable incomes, high energy rates or energy costs, and inefficient homes. So a combination of these three things creates the conditions under which energy poverty can happen, but the way it shows up in people's lives depends on your own lived experiences. So, for example, if you're a renter, you have very limited ability to take control of energy in your home. And a vast majority of renters in Canada live in private rental housing, and a vast majority of them are responsible for their own energy bills. And so, while the conditions that create energy poverty might be common, the consequences for a renter are different from a homeowner, right? Because a renter, you can get evicted if you miss one utility payment. If you're a senior, for example, energy poverty means that your mobility in your home is restricted because it's either too cold or too warm. During extreme weather events like in the summers, you are prone to heat deaths due to extreme temperatures. Or in winters, because your mobility is restricted, it can create conditions where your increased risk for falling or your increased risk for experiencing cardiovascular illnesses and so on. If you're a single parent, for example, you might not necessarily even experience low incomes, but because you have such depleted resilience, because you're dealing with so much in life, and a vast majority of single parents in Canada are single mothers. You're dealing with kids and education and a job and this and that. You might not have the bandwidth, even if you own your own home and even if you have the financial means to do so, you might not have the bandwidth to organize contractors to come in and take a look at and schedule quotes and do installations and improve energy efficiency. So to sum it all up, I think while the underlying conditions are high energy rates, low disposable incomes, and I'll maybe later on make a distinction between what disposable incomes and low incomes mean, and poor quality homes or inefficient homes. So these things together create the conditions, but the way it shows up behind closed doors really depends on who you are, where you live, and what pre-existing conditions and vulnerabilities you might already be experiencing.
On sort of the energy rates, can you talk a little bit about how energy rates differ across the country and what sort of risk factors might lead somebody to be paying really high rates? Aside from the efficiency of their homes, we could talk about that after too.
There's a geographic patterning to how energy rates show up. And you are right. The three things we talked about, rates and poor quality homes and low disposable incomes, they're interrelated. So one thing leads to another. But if two homes are created equal, let's say they're equally energy efficient, energy rates vary from province to province. So in Ontario, for example, electricity rates are higher than where I live, which is in Winnipeg in Manitoba. Electricity rates are lower. Energy use in homes is a function not just of the condition of the home or poor efficiency of the home, but also what you need as an individual to meet your basic human needs as a person, right? So it's not just the rates, but rates combined with your energy use is what creates it. And so, for example, seniors have different energy needs, and people with disability and long-term chronic illnesses have energy needs in relation to medical equipment, things that they need to manage their condition. And their energy needs differ from someone else who is perhaps renting one room in a three-bedroom home with other roommates. So there's aspects of energy use in your home that you can control and can't control. Now, oftentimes in conversations like this, I think there is a certain tendency to say that, oh, well, people just need more information on how they can reduce their energy use better, right? So they can manage their energy use. Maybe a large part of this is people don't know how to, reduce their energy use and keep their costs low and stuff like that. But what research has found is that a lot of households experiencing energy poverty are already self-rationing energy use. And so what they'll do is they'll turn down the thermostat and put on multiple different layers because of the worry of high energy costs. Other things people will do is they'll compromise, for example, on nutritious food and make choices between heating and eating. So the ways in which people act to counteract high energy costs is often counterproductive to their immediate health and also the long-term health of their home. When sometimes what people will do is they'll close off vents in certain rooms and heat just one room with a small portable heater. And what that does, unfortunately, is it leads to moisture and dampness in walls and rooms that are not heated. And that causes long-term damage to the walls, mold, which then again leads to health problems and issues and stuff like that, right? So the knee-jerk reactions that people take to reduce energy costs because they don't have the ability to for a combination of reasons to make these long-term efforts to improve energy efficiency ends up being counterproductive. Now, another way to look at this is in rural communities. When you look at your electricity bill, there's a portion of your bill that is just delivery charges, which pays for wires and stuff that come out to your home. And so, regardless of how much energy you use, you have to pay a certain amount of money, fixed money every month, just to have the privilege of being able to turn your lights on every day. And so even if your home was net zero energy, you would still have to pay a delivery charge. And so there's certain parts of your bill that you cannot materially reduce. And the other sections of your bill are things that if you do take actions to reduce, they come at a cost of making compromises in other aspects of your life.
I'm wondering if we could talk maybe about home quality and what sort of might lead one home to be less energy efficient than another, because it does seem those two sides seem to be pretty closely connected.
I get very cold in my Winnipeg home because A, it's Winnipeg, and B, it's very old, and C, is because I'm not used to, like, literally my body, my physiology, I suspect, because I grew up climbing coconut trees and not being used to such cold weather. I don't think physically my body has developed like blood vessels in my fingertips and my toes to be able to withstand these temperatures, right? So homes alone, and so this is the interplay, is that it's a combination of the home and the person that's living in it. You could take two homes built by the same builder right next to each other with roughly the same layout and everything, and you could end up with two entirely different conditions that lead to energy poverty. Some of it is how we use energy in home. Some of it is just very simple things like insulation and air sealing. So the things that are between you and the outside environment determine how tight your home is and how much of your heat you can hold on to. Physicists will tell you that holding on to heat is very difficult. Heat and water want to go where they want to go. And if there's a differential between inside and outside, heat will find ways of leaking. Now, if you look at your home and if there's like tiny gaps between your inside and outside environment and you sum it all up together, it would look like a giant basketball size hole in your wall, right? Now, if you sat here and you looked at your wall and you saw a giant basketball size hole, you'd be like, oh man, I gotta fix this. I gotta get on top of this, because you will feel the heat leaving. But because we don't see it in that respect, and these tiny holes and cracks around your windows or between your wall, inside wall and outside wall, heat is constantly always leaking. So that's one part of it. One part of it is just the quality of homes, when they were built and why they were built. A majority of homes in Canada were built before 1990s, when energy efficiency was a part of the building codes. And so older homes tend to be more inefficient. The pernicious problem here, Kristen, is that you can't deal with this in a kind of a piecemeal way. But I don't want to discourage people from taking efforts, right? So any little bit that you can do can help, like caulking your doors, sealing your windows, putting those door stoppers, all those things will help. But the thing about homes is that home is a system. It's a complex system. The recommendation is that you treat this home as a complex system and then you take efforts to deal with them as a whole. And so what can happen, unfortunately, is that if you add insulation or do air sealing in just one part of your home, heat and moisture will find other ways of trying to get out. They might end up, and condensation might end up in places where you're not paying attention. So quality of homes and when they were built and stuff matters, but how we approach this and taking kind of a whole home approach to improving the quality of homes is also critical in helping people get out of energy poverty. What this ties into is, when we see policy direction in Canada right now, where, it seems to me a lot of the focus is on switching oil furnaces to heat pumps, for example, right? So switching one box that gives you heating or cooling for another box alone is not sufficient to get people out of energy poverty, because it's not just about high energy bills. It's about what your home does to contribute or not to your well-being. It's to do that, you need to take kind of like a whole home approach.
I'm curious about sort of like other forms of energy efficiency. Is heating sort of like the biggest form of energy use in a home? And what are some of the others that could be made more efficient?
Heating air, indoor spaces, and water is the majority of energy used in a home. Yes, there's appliances and stuff, but modern appliances are more and more energy efficient. So a vast majority, and especially if you want to talk about greenhouse gas emissions, 85% of greenhouse gas emissions in homes and in buildings comes from space heating and water heating. So improving energy efficiency in a home and making homes more durable is kind of like more like a marathon than a sprint. So every time there's an opportunity for upgrading your furnace, let's say, right? Upgrading it to something that's more energy efficient or perhaps something that's more clean, like a heat pump, presents an opportunity for improving energy efficiency of the home or decarbonizing a home. Now, unfortunately, the biggest line items here, right? Space heater, water heaters, in vast majority of cases in Canada, they're replaced in an emergency situation under duress. I can guarantee you that when your furnace breaks, it will happen during the 2 or 3 coldest weeks of the year. And when, when that happens, you've got family over for Christmas, kids at home, and that'll be the largest unbudgeted expense you'll make in that year. And that'll be the most uncomfortable you'll feel in your home, because if your home is not, thermally resilient, it doesn't hold heat. If your furnace breaks down 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, you're starting to feel cold, right? Kids are crying. You just want someone to come in and say, I want this done quick, fast, cheap. Who can I find that can come in tomorrow, get this done? Under those circumstances, because your bandwidth is so limited, usually what will happen, contractor will come in, they'll look at what box you have, they'll tell you, they'll give you a like-for-like box. You'll look at 3 quotes, you'll go for the cheapest and fastest quote, and they'll be done. And now what you've done is you've locked in perhaps a less efficient and perhaps a fossil fuel generating heating source in your home for another 15 or 20 years. Our existing business models are kind of locked into the cycle where most of this replacement happens under duress. And so if we slowed down this process a little bit, and if homeowners were a little bit more proactive about taking home as a system and plan for these outlays, then there would be a little bit more bandwidth to start thinking about, even in situations where heat pumps are clearly cheaper in the long run or more clean and efficient, there aren't entry points into making that happen. And all of these dynamics that I just explained are significantly more difficult for low to moderate income households because they cannot afford the upfront costs of undertaking some of these improvements, and B, a vast majority of them rent or live in housing situations that doesn't allow them to have the permission to have that. And even if they do, and even if we found ways of reducing upfront cost barriers, there's also other considerations around like reducing risks for minimizing comfort issues or minimizing mold and condensation and damp issues that aren't in play when we're only focused on treating energy efficiency as like switching one box for a more efficient box.
I want to pick up a little bit more on this sort of renter-landlord dilemma. There seems to be a big gap in incentives, right? If you're saying most of the country that rents is paying for their utilities, but doesn't have control to sort of make those energy efficient investments, what is the best way to sort of put forward an incentive that would benefit both the landlord and the renter?
Yeah, that seems like a tough nut to crack, isn't it? Because it's phrased as like 2 competing objectives. On one hand, we want to improve the quality of homes and quality of living conditions in private rental spaces. But any kind of like regulatory mechanisms or incentives that we line up to incent landlords to improve housing quality, the worry there is that the costs will be passed down to tenants and the benefits will accrue to landlords. What we've argued, and that we wrote a report, we've laid out how that there's a mix of policies that you can take. You can take some policies from incentivizing energy efficiency in buildings, and you can take some policies for improving tenant protections, and you can mix them together to create an environment under which we can achieve both of these objectives. All federal energy efficiency initiatives in Canada today are primarily for homeowners, and there's like a small separate stream for social and affordable housing. But 5 out of 6 Canadians lives in private market rentals, right? So there's really no programs available for private market rentals. Even in provincial programs, the comprehensive energy upgrade programs in most provinces, they're only available for homeowners. In most provinces, renters get like an energy saving kit. So you get a box with like some LED light bulbs, a cloth string, I can't even say the word right, to hang your clothes, and a little couple of things like that, right? So they're not comprehensive upgrades. So there is a big gap, in part because the narrow focus of provincial utility programs is the mandate is to reduce energy efficiency, and they don't have really the mandate to kind of deal with downstream consequences of what might happen. If you improve energy efficiency comprehensively for rental home, what if the landlord decides to evict the tenants and increase the rents? Or what if we had like a minimum building performance standard and we required all rental housing to reach a certain efficiency standard? Will that lead to eviction of tenants and blah, blah, blah? So these are considerations that aren't in play. And so vast majority of existing policies focus on homeowners. One thing you could do is to expand existing programs to include rental housing and do that in a way that if you're a landlord and you receive federal funding or provincial funding to improve energy efficiency of your rental property, you may be required to sign what's called an affordability covenant, where you will say that you'll ensure that the benefits of the improved energy efficiency accrue primarily to tenants. So what that means is that if you as a landlord are paying the utility bills, then the energy efficiency measures are not going to reduce energy costs, but they'll be focused on improving comfort and quality of life in homes. But if the tenant is paying utility bills, then the measures that will be chosen will primarily be for reducing energy use for the tenants. And then you will not increase rents beyond whatever provincial guidelines exist. And then you will not evict tenants for a certain number of years. We came up with what we called like a renter's bill of rights in a net zero economy, where you as a renter have the right to know how much energy expenditure you can expect before you rent a home. Because for most households, after taxes and rent, utilities are the single largest uncontrollable expense, an unknowable expense. And that's a huge burden for a lot of low-income households who typically tend to be renters. Before a energy retrofit project starts, you'll have the right to informed consent on what kind of measures that you want to prioritize so that landlords are not prioritizing measures that don't directly benefit you. While renovations are happening in your unit, you should have the right to perhaps like some kind of alternative accommodations or right to not being disturbed while these renovations are happening. And then after these renovations happen, that you're protected from being evicted. There's certain fundamental rights that I think that if federal and provincial policies are aligned to providing tenants, then it becomes a lot more easier for us to layer on building performance standards, incentives, and programs so that when they happen, the negative consequences are not downloaded on to tenants. So these two things have to kind of happen in tandem. Looking at energy efficiency policies alone or incentive policies alone might not be sufficient, and doing tenant protection policies alone might not be sufficient. They might actually be counterproductive. So we've seen this happen in Europe, where rental housing and senior housing are exempt from some minimum building performance standards. And so what happens inevitably is you end up with low housing standards in rental housing. And we don't want that either, right? Both of these have to kind of have to tango together.
I want to get more into the policy, but just before I do, there's a pretty pervasive sort of idea out there that heat pumps don't work if it gets cold in the winter. I wonder if you could speak to that, and what would your reaction be to that myth?
We at Efficiency Canada, we actually just recently put out like a Mythbuster report, and it busts some common myths, including some of this that heat pumps don't work under cold climates. So now I understand where that myth comes from, because where you see heat pumps largely dominating heating in Canadian homes is mostly in the Atlantic provinces, where they may not experience as much cold temperatures as like I do in the prairies of Manitoba. And also is that the earlier generation of technology may not have been itself sufficient to meet the challenges of cold temperatures. The good news is nowadays you get cold climate heat pumps, and they're specifically designed to meet the cold temperature standards of here in Canada. And they come with their own supplemental heating units. So they have resistance heating that kicks in during those, negative 30, negative 35. I'll be honest with you, I live in Winnipeg. There is a fear of those cold days, but they're few and far between. Like we don't live here in perpetual darkness or perpetual negative 30 degrees. It's like maybe a few days in the year. So when those few days when it does drop below a certain temperature, your supplemental heating unit will kick in. So your heat pump can keep chugging along. And so that technically they work. We've had demonstration projects in Yukon, and they have them in Norway and Finland. And so as far as technology goes, cold climate heat pumps can meet the needs of most climates in most parts of Canada. So that's not the issue. The challenge can be that the business model between homeowners and contractors, increasingly we're seeing a lot, deployment of heat pumps, cold climate heat pumps, but contractors in Canada are just not used to delivering cold climate heat pumps. And there's some confusion around like what it means to have the heat pump alone and what it means for your insurance and the insurance companies. There is some lack of clarity around because insurance companies require some kind of backup heat. Cold climate heat pumps come with their own backup heat, but do insurance companies recognize residents of backup? There's these like technical issues that, because some of this is just fairly new in some parts of Canada, like in the prairie provinces, these are just like market issues that will just get ironed out over time, right? So I'm not too worried about that. My worry about heat pumps is that they're seen as like this like silver bullet for solving what is actually a socioeconomic problem. So my definition of energy poverty is that it's a set of social and economic challenges or inequalities that can be addressed with energy efficiency. You want to improve kids' concentration in schools. Do you want to help people's reduce food insecurity, improve housing security, help seniors retire in place? You want to help people with chronic conditions manage their conditions better. Socioeconomic challenges can be addressed by improving energy efficiency in homes. So energy poverty to me is a set of those conditions. Simply switching out one thing with a heat pump alone is not going to minimize some of these risks. What it does, and we have to recognize this and celebrate this, reducing upfront costs for switching to heat pumps is a good thing. But that alone by itself is not sufficient, and we shouldn't put all our eggs, all our energy poverty eggs and all our climate eggs into this one heat pump basket, in as much as I think they're a beautiful piece of technology.
Right. So there's lots of other retrofits somebody could decide to carry out that might make more sense.
Especially for low-income households, right? Because we have to be very mindful of the downstream risks that just switching out, a furnace for a heat pump can cause on a home. Picture a giant basketball-sized hole in your wall. Having a heat pump is not going to do much if you keep having that hole in your wall.
Can you talk to me a little bit about some of the policies and programs governments can put in place to encourage energy efficient building retrofits?
So let's start maybe at the federal level and we can zoom in. So at the federal level, I think the federal government is best positioned to align energy poverty with net zero pathways. The federal government, in their climate emission reduction plan and in their housing plan, they say that in the transition to net zero future, they don't want to leave anyone behind. What other countries are doing, for example, in the UK, their climate targets explicitly have targets for reducing energy poverty in homes. So in the UK, for example, they have mandatory building labeling. And so you can actually it's public data. You can go look up the energy rating of any home. And then now we know what homes need more supports and what homes don't, right? And so they can target and focus efforts towards homes that need it the most. And so their measure of energy poverty is called LILE, low income, low efficiency. So lowest income households living in the least efficient homes get most of the policy supports. It's a combination of incentives and regulations. So you cannot rent a home out if your home falls below a minimum threshold. Now, obviously, we don't want to create a situation where you're taking rental housing off the market. So what the government then does, it gives you like a couple of years and gives you incentives and grants so you can at least come meet the minimum standard and know over the years what that minimum standard is. Used to be F and G, and now it's like slowly moving up to C. In climate targets, explicitly says that houses living in the least income homes will live at least in a home that's like moderately efficient or something like that. So there's like policy focus that centers the needs of homes that need energy efficiency the most in climate targets. Now in Canada, we don't have that. We don't even have a formal definition of energy poverty other than kind of like vague language about leaving no one behind. But what our policies do is they're leaving renters behind. They're leaving low-income households behind. And they're leaving a vast majority of Canadians who don't heat with oil, but heat with natural gas, electricity, and wood and propane. They're being left behind from federal initiatives. So what the federal government can do, very high level, set a target. Say by X date, least efficient homes and least income households will no longer live in least efficient homes or something like that. And then create flexibility for provinces, municipalities, private foundations, private investment, nonprofits, community housing, for all of them to meet those targets and create the kind of the supportive environment and have a long run of funding to enable that. Now, in the US, over the past 50 years, 50 years, the federal government has had a program for improving energy efficiency in low-income houses. And think of all the administrations the US has been through, right? Especially recently. It survived. What the federal government does is that every year It allocates funding to the states based on, it's a little bit of a complicated math, but based on population, based on energy rates, and based on poverty levels. The state provinces get the funding, states get the funding, and then what states can do is that they can take that funding and they layer their own funding on top of that so that the federal money can go much further, right? So utility programs and provincial programs, they have a very narrow focus. What they're very good at is reaching households and engaging them in energy efficiency. So in Canada, for the past 15, 20 years, there have been long running programs that have relationships with community organizations, social housing, that are engaging low-income Canadians in energy efficiency, but they're very constrained in what they can do because they're like narrowly focused on kilowatt hours, reducing kilowatt hours. What federal funding can do is like layer on top of that and say, you can now go into more homes. You can now, while you're in people's homes, do non-energy upgrades like mold remediation, for example, or closing up like electrical outlets, doing things like that, that utility programs are really not, they don't have the mandate to do. And in fact, households that need energy efficiency the most, for example, households that have mold and condensation issues, are disqualified from provincial energy efficiency programs because it's like a health and safety risk, right? So it's a chicken and egg problem. This is where federal funding can come in, set high level targets and say, we need to get here, and then have provinces and municipalities and everyone kind of row in that direction.
Yeah, it seems like a good opportunity to put climate resilience, to add that angle in as well, doesn't it?
Nailed it. Well, so what would that mean for you think?
Resilience to floods, access to air conditioning. Those are the things I'm thinking of, but I'm sure you've got more.
That's great, right? Because I would agree with that. And one way of thinking of climate resilience is thermal resilience. So if your power went off, how long can you live in your home, right? With no active mechanical heating or cooling. As we found out a couple of years ago, unfortunately, and when there was a heat dome in BC and Alberta, people died. And a vast majority of them, 98% of them, died in their own homes. And a significant majority of them were seniors living alone in rental housing because they don't have the thermal resilience to keep heat out, and in the winters to keep heat in. And so improving like thermal resilience and climate resilience of homes would be a factor in all this, right? And so you're not just like, rather than focus on like these, provincial programs with a narrow focus, and they're doing good things, I don't want to knock on them, but with their narrow mandates, what the federal funding can do is expand them and help them improve things like climate resilience, reduce the risks of mold and condensation and things like that. At the municipal level, as the government closest to people, I think municipal governments are ideally positioned to reach hard to reach households, and they have multiple touch points. So through food banks or through tax clinics, municipal governments are providing services to people that need it the most. And so that would be an entry point into using energy efficiency as a tool for improving the quality of life for people. And rather than have these like high, rather than like think about kilowatt hour targets or greenhouse gas targets, how do we use energy efficiency to improve housing and reduce inequality? In many cities across the country, we are in the midst of a housing crisis, right? And so using energy efficiency as a way to reduce housing costs and improving outcomes for renters and things like that is well within a municipal government's immediate priorities. And so I think this is where governments can land. And I know what happens sometimes is that I know municipal governments across the country are doing, they have a lot of programs to help. They have their own financing programs and retrofit programs and things like that to help homeowners. And that's great. But as far as energy poverty is concerned, I think that there is perhaps a bit of like a missile, like there's a bit of like a passing the football between different levels of government. I'd like to see a strategy, perhaps with the forthcoming federal green building strategy, that lays out specific like roles and responsibilities at different levels of government so that everyone is doing what they're ideally positioned to do. And then we can help lift people out of energy poverty. And through doing that, help us get closer to our climate targets.
I think you've maybe answered a lot of this question, but I'm curious if you can talk, if there's anything that you'd want to add on sort of the question of how we target low income or energy insecure households.
I'm working on a report right now to kind of capture like lived experiences of vulnerable communities with energy poverty. And it's a bit of a delicate undertaking because, vulnerable communities are not a monolith. What I'm hoping to construct is like certain archetypal experiences of what that would look like. So there's barriers and there's risks. Barriers are things that prevent low income households or vulnerable communities from accessing energy efficiency programs and services. Risks are downstream negative consequences that come from perhaps even participating in some of these energy efficiency initiatives and doing it in a way that is it's not productive, right? So let me give you an example. If you're a low-income household, a barrier to energy efficiency is upfront costs. One solution to that would be to reduce the upfront costs by giving you a zero interest loan. It's what the Green Homes Initiative program does. They give you a small portion of that upfront as a grant, but a vast majority of that is a loan. Now, the risks of that for a low income household is that low income households are already over leveraged on debt. Now, you have to make these monthly payments. What is going to happen to that household if they miss a payment? Will they then go start borrowing from payday loans? Will they go start borrowing from credit cards? And there's examples of newcomers, for example, who may not have. And I moved to Canada in 2016. I had never used a credit card before. On my first week here, I went to a big box store and I was buying stuff I need for my home. The cashier at the checkout was trying to sign me up for a credit card, and I didn't understand. They made it sound like I would get a 30% discount on everything if I just signed this dotted line. And I just had enough paranoia and self-preservation to not sign up for this. But I know from experiences like mine that a lot of people who do not have the same history with like credit scores and managing credit, we used to live on savings in India all the time, right? So for people who may not be familiar with the financial landscape here and things like that, you might end up putting them in further risk of debt. So the success condition of energy efficiency is not how many people are accessing your program, but it's like how many of them are actively experiencing well-being from participating in your program. And so my advice for people who are designing programs and policies is to not just focus on removing barriers, but to like journey map people's experiences through the project and understand what risks they might be facing and how to minimize them. For rural households, they have to pay upfront for propane. In urban environments, in the winters, in most provinces in Canada, they have a moratorium or a ban on disconnecting utilities. If you're low income and you run through some cash flow issues, they will not disconnect your heating during winters if you're on electricity or gas. But if you're on propane, you have to pay upfront. The other challenge is you have the single gigantic upfront payment to fill up propane or heating oil in your home. And that also happens at a time when in most rural households, the economy is seasonal. And in winters, they're not earning a paycheck, right? A lot of households, they work in forestry or in tourism industry. And so when your cash flow is low and you have a sudden uncontrollable expense, where are people getting that money from? And so they will borrow from friends, they'll borrow from family, and they'll borrow from unreliable sources and put their household finances in further risk. And so I think when we think about energy efficiency and using financing and grants as an option for vulnerable households, I want to highlight that just giving them access alone is not a sufficient condition for success.
I can see how designing a program that's maybe not targeted towards low-income groups, you might want to have a component that's loan-based, because for a lot of people, that's going to be fine. But I think it was really helpful for you to highlight how for some households, that's really not fine. And what do you think is the solution then? Is it just paying the full cost of the retrofit?
Yeah, I think there's definitely elements of that. So I think what we need is like a fundamental market transformation of how we think about retrofits, and retrofits are often an afterthought. I think the numbers say like 43% or 45%, or let's say half of Canadians plan some kind of home improvement project every year. So it could be, major home renos like kitchen or lifestyle changes like adding another secondary unit or something like that. It could be like maintenance, or it can be like energy retrofits. But when they're making those changes, their focus is on aesthetic preferences or lifestyle changes. It's not on improving energy efficiency. So I think the value of energy efficiency is not well understood and articulated when people are making purchasing decisions. I think the danger here, there is an element of danger here where some people might interpret what I'm saying here to say that vulnerable people are helpless and then they don't have any resilience. And then, we need to kind of like, lift them up and blah, 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 and empower them. That's not what I'm saying. I want to make that very clear. People in different life circumstances are prioritizing their needs and acting on their immediate needs. Newcomers, seniors, rural households, single parents, people with illnesses, everyone is prioritizing their immediate needs as they should. It's not a personal failing on their part. It's not like they're not doing enough for the climate change, stuff like that. People are prioritizing their own immediate needs. Now, we as a society, I believe we have a collective responsibility for changing how our business models work and how energy efficiency is seen, and then creating circumstances and conditions and business models through which energy efficiency is used as a tool to help address these problems and challenges. Kristen, it took me, after I moved to Canada, it took me about 5 years to get to a point where I could establish a credit history. I could not renovate my home even if I owned my own home, right? I couldn't do any of those things. And so in some ways, it's very fashionable to call for a whole of government approach. I know that, Climate Canada's 2030 climate emission plan says retrofitting buildings calls for a whole of government approach, and it's like a retrofit mission, and we need all hands on deck, and that's true. But I think an underlying dynamic here that is missing is that people are already taking actions that matter to them in their own lives. And so it's not just paying for all upgrades, and it's not just requiring buildings to meet a certain standard. It's fundamentally changing the business models under which this happens, so that when I am doing a kitchen reno, my contractor is able to offer to me, hey, while you're undertaking this massive project, you can also, for this amount, you can actually live in a home that actually feels more comfortable if you just upgraded insulation a little bit better. For low-income households or renter households, we have minimum standards for housing, right? You wouldn't accept a housing that didn't have a shower, didn't have a functioning toilet. So in the net zero future, we shouldn't accept housing that doesn't meet certain energy efficiency standards. And so it's our collective commitment to ensuring that there are certain rights and there are certain responsibilities, and there are certain business models that cater to ensuring energy efficiency is a part of these decisions that people are making. So talking about business model transformation and changing all of that, so that when low-income households and vulnerable households are making choices that matter to them, energy efficiency is a part of the default, not an additional chore or burden. I think that's where we'd like to get to.
Do you have any thoughts on what the pathway to get to that new business model would be?
I have several thoughts on it. You'll be happy to know, not just one thought. But one way to do that, like a ladder of progression, right? So a simple way to do that would be to have energy labeling of all buildings. Now, energy labeling in the UK is not perfect. It's far from perfect, but it's a place to start. Like right now, we don't know how many homes are not meeting energy efficiency standards. Is it 5%, 15%, 25%? We have no freaking idea. How many low-income households are living in these homes? We don't know. And so how are we going to take action if we don't know, right? So that would be the first place to start, is if we knew where the most vulnerable households are living in the most inefficient homes, that would be a place to start. And so when we start from there, then we can align programs and policies to meet them where they're at. I'll give you an example. Ann Arbor is a city in Michigan. They're a somewhat wealthy community. So with that context, they have a program that's called Aging Efficiently in Place. So what that is that if you're a senior, you want to retire in your own home, and research shows that as people age and get older, they are more and more reluctant to leave their home because they have thick ties to the local community. They have a home that they're used to, and they're worried about moving somewhere else where the housing and the community might not meet their needs. And now what then ends up happening is people end up living in their family home that they can't afford to upkeep, that doesn't, meet their needs because it's got you see behind me, spiral staircase to go up to your attic bedroom. And so they're caught between a rock and a hard place, right? So what Aging Efficiently in Place does, they give you a combination of loans and grants and funding, and to not just give you an energy advisor that will help you figure out what energy retrofits you need to make in your home, but you also get a personal support worker and a physiotherapist, so that these measures would also fund things like anti-skid bathroom tiles, guardrails, and things like that. So while you're making energy efficiency upgrades, you're also making your home better meet your needs. This is what people want out of their homes, right? What people want is something that meets their needs and ensures their well-being. Energy efficiency or climate are broader social goals. Individual goals, people want a home that they can belong to and a place that they can call home and a community that they feel like they belong to. And if we align our climate policies and energy efficiency policies at the kitchen table, where people are having these conversations with contractors in ways that aligns with what their immediately needs and prioritize, I think that's our pathway. It's going to take a little bit of creativity. It's going to take a basket of approaches and bringing expertise from different areas, reducing energy poverty, right? Would you say that's an anti-poverty program? Would you say that is like an energy efficiency retrofit climate program? Or would you say that is a social program?
It's difficult. When you were talking about that aging in place program, I was thinking about like, oh, this is an infrastructure project and health and, social welfare and natural resources in a way as well. I guess it centers well-being. So I'll say it's a well-being program. What do you think?
I agree, and that is the tragedy of the situation, right? Is because everyone is working at this in silos. Utility programs are focused on a certain silo. Public health is focused on a certain silo. Like municipalities have like minimum temperature standards. So in winters, you're expected your home to heat at least to 21 degrees and stuff like that. So everyone is working on a silo, and so we don't really have. I mean, again, it's very fashionable to call for like programs across different silos, but I think a large part of why everyone is kind of working independently is because we haven't had a kind of national target and goal so that we're all kind of rowing in the same direction. One of the advantages is of this being, not just a climate program, but a broader socioeconomic and health project is that it brings in expertise from other areas and people who know what seniors want and need and prioritize, people who know experiences of newcomers, people who know what it's like to be a single parent, and they have touch points with different public services and agencies. And so leveraging their expertise, leveraging their touch points to deliver solutions to homes that meets their immediate needs, I think is the opportunity here that we are currently not tapping into.
And we often hear, like in the climate space, that we need a whole of society approach. So I think everything you've said today gives a really good example from like the home energy efficiency perspective of what that really means and how it could shape not only our sort of net zero trajectories, but also really improve lives for a lot of people. Is there any sort of last thoughts that you'd want to add before we end?
What I will say is this: addressing energy poverty is not just an issue of justice, but it's also fundamentally at a very pragmatic level. If we are to get to our climate goals, the road to 2050 net zero will have to go through every single home. And some homes have the ability to undertake some of these retrofits, and some homes don't. We need a strategy for dealing with homes and households for whom this is not a priority. Oftentimes, the conversation about energy poverty gets wrapped up into like it is very easily politicized, right? It's easy to pit one group of vulnerable people against the other, or it's easy to say these policies will actually make energy poverty worse, or these policies will blah blah blah, and energy poverty gets wrapped up in these kind of like in this discourse. A more sober analysis of energy poverty will show you that people are already experiencing vulnerabilities to housing, to health, to food. What energy poverty does is it makes it worse. There's only one of three things you can do, right? You can improve people's incomes, which is a long-term project. You can, reduce energy rates, which is again a long-term project. The only thing you can do at a targeted way, you can deploy immediately, and you can deploy to households that need it the most. Identify these households, these neighborhoods, they need it the most immediately today to improve their well-being and livelihood is energy efficiency. While we focus on kind of longer term projects like improving people's livelihoods, giving them more economic opportunities, improving their health and well-being in life. So those are kind of baseline, high level kind of climate and social policies. And so those need to happen simultaneously. What energy efficiency can do is to, on the baseline of those policies, target specific households that need it the most and help alleviate their problems today. And so my pitch for energy poverty is that let's use energy efficiency as a tool to help households that need it the most, like immediately, while we're also continuing to gain momentum on our broader national, social, and climate policies.
Kristen, I don't know if you talked about heat pumps enough. Should we talk about heat pumps some more at the end here?
I was actually at an event a couple of months ago where like literally the whole audience was up in arms because somebody said something wrong about heat pumps. Like people really care about heat pumps, but it's actually not the whole thing, you know? As I think Abhi explained pretty well.
Yeah, no, Abhi is so well spoken. I loved the stories that he dropped in. That's so charming. He's so charming. I think this was one of our best episodes this season, and it's on arguably the most boring subject.
Yeah, I mean, I guess listeners, if they've made it to this point, probably agree too. But I thought that Abhi was really compelling, and he made like can be a very dry topic, as you mentioned, very engaging and easy to understand for folks. So I really appreciated that.
I think that the one thing that is missing from this conversation is the focus on renters. And I know that we covered it a little bit in the episode where, you asked what sort of solutions there are for renters, but the answer is that there isn't really, except that landlords need to step up more. And that's really frustrating considering so many people in Canada, and I'm sure most of our listeners, are renters, and that is only set to continue to increase over time as all of these big conglomerates are buying up all of the affordable housing. Don't get us started on that. So it's kind of frustrating because this is one of those things where we really do need a government-led action plan. Homeowners can do a little bit, but it's hard for them too. And we really need to pick up the pace. Like we're doing a little bit, but it's not on track to meet our climate goals for 2050 by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, we're going in the wrong direction in a lot of ways, And so it's retrofitting our homes is going to help people in more than just one way. It's not just good for the climate. But even if it was, let's do it.
Yeah, and I think there's some other countries and like subnational jurisdictions that are doing a really good job with this and that are really, I think, making the right choice and that are, I think, targeting the people who need it most, which I really like. Whether it's seniors or people with health conditions where like living in a drafty home can be really unsafe or uncomfortable, or whether it's people on low incomes. There's a program in California where they provide completely free retrofits to people in low income communities, which is good because like even if you own your home, if you're living in a low income community, a grant that covers part of the cost of a retrofit isn't necessarily going to be something you can access, which was a point that the Affordability Action Council made last year that I found really persuasive. I would really point people to read their reports because they were really good.
Thanks, Kristen, for putting this episode together. When I went to edit it, I thought it was going to be so boring, and then I was like riveted the whole time. So this was fantastic. Abhi was fantastic. And if listeners want more fantastic left-leaning progressive podcasts, they can check out the Harbinger Media Network at harbingermedianetwork.com for all of our sister shows. Thank you so much. We'll catch you on the next episode. We are grateful to be learning and unlearning on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, as well as the ancestral unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. We encourage listeners to visit native-land.ca to learn more about the history of their own territory and to read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action.